Chapter 4. Luke woke up in chains. The force binders were still heavy around his wrists, but traditional shackles were fastened to his arms right above them, each secured to the arm of an old, uncomfortable, and unfortunately solid metal chair. Even in his unconsciousness, they had begun to chafe. Startled and still bleary with sleep, he tried to move, only to discover his legs were chained to the chair as well. "So the hallowed Jedi Master is awake," a familiar voice drawled. Luke tried to open his eyes, his situation rushing back, but before he could, a fist impacted his jaw, hard. Blinking away the pain, Luke's eyes finally opened to the sight of Mara driving her fist into the gut of the bounty hunter who had just punched him. Her eyes gleamed bright yellow even in the dim light, and Luke's fear devoured him. "The prisoner is mine to break." That was the deal. Mara's face was a rictus of anger as she spoke. Where their bond should have been, there was only silence. Silence from their bond, and silence from the Force. "You presume to dictate to agents of the Empire what to do with our prisoner," the Inquisitor accused, drawing himself up to his full height. "My prisoner," Mara snapped. "A fact you would do well to remember, before I am forced to demonstrate why I was the Emperor's hand, and you were a common Inquisitor." The Inquisitor's gaze hardened, but Mara continued without stopping. "I captured him where you never could, with the understanding that Luke Skywalker is mine to break, and mine to turn." She paused, then laughed, the malice in her voice echoing against the stone walls of the cell. Even in the beginning, Luke had never heard her sound so cruel. "Or do you think you can bring the strongest Jedi in the galaxy to our side yourself?" With a gasp, Luke rocketed upright, suddenly awake. He could feel the hard stone bunk beneath him. He could still hear Mara's laughter and the pain it promised. But no, that wasn't how it happened. Luke tried to force himself to stop hyperventilating, and only half managed. That wasn't how it happened. He had been on the plan. Mara had just been pretending. The bond had been silent, yes, but only so she could keep herself from reacting to his reactions. The burning yellow of her eyes had been colored contact lenses. He'd put on those binders himself. And while they had worked in the dream, in real life, he'd sabotaged them before putting them on. He'd never been helpless. He and Mara had been in on it together. She hadn't betrayed him. She'd had to do some painful things in order to keep up the charade, but only with his permission, and she'd hated it far more than he had. After that first punch, she'd never let anyone else lay a hand on him. He'd never been helpless. Mara hadn't turned. Finally, his breath slowed to a normal pace. Slowly, carefully, he opened his eyes, and immediately met Mara's. Green. They were green. "Luke," she was thinking at him loudly, "I'm here. You're safe. Things are hard but you're safe. We're fine. We'll be fine. I'm here." Slowly, Luke breathed, wishing he could inhale her litany, take it into him and let Mara's love chase out the remnants of the nightmare entirely. It wasn't that easy, but Luke would manage. Her voice helped, soothing and caring and exactly as it should be. It was just a nightmare. He'd be fine. It might take a few more minutes, but it would be. After flicking his eyes to make sure that Valen and the Inquisitor were both still asleep, Luke smiled at her, trying to make his body language reassuring as he could. She seemed to get the message, relaxing as her litany slowed. Since she couldn't reach his mind, hear any reassurances he did send, that would have to do. Luke's only hope was that she didn't guess what he'd been dreaming about. She was trying not to let on, but that Luke knew her too well. She was beating herself up about the mission enough already. Even though he'd agreed to it, even though she'd done the best she could have, the last thing she needed was more reason to feel guilty. So the asteroid belt was hard. And the asteroid belt after that, and the one after that, but it's not like any of them were harder than Beggar's Canyon. So how does that count for experience with evasive piloting? Sure, Luke had to act evil more than he wanted to, but that didn't mean he couldn't get caught up in a rare, brief rapport and genuine reminiscing with his father. Especially since him doing that on occasion was helping keep Mara safe. But Anakin Skywalker didn't make another gently teasing retort about genetics and flying. Instead he stared straight at Luke, gaze suddenly uncertain. Beggar's Canyon. Oh, shit. That probably explained the look. Beru and Owen hadn't told him much about Anakin Skywalker, but they'd certainly established that he'd grown up on Tatooine, unless that had been a lie too. Grown up on Tatooine, until he was freed from slavery at the age of 9. Yeah, Luke could see why his father might have bad memories of the place, but he couldn't exactly back up the revelation. "Yeah, I grew up on Tatooine," Since the Jedi apparently took children at birth and hadn't that been a surprise, he wasn't sure how he could explain where he grew up. But since they also outlawed having children, maybe there was a chance Anakin would just accept it. Anakin's face grew pale. His eyes were suddenly distant and horrified. His mouth trembled, like he was about to say something, then couldn't quite. Then Luke. His voice was astonishingly gentle, even in the throes of what seemed to be terror. How old were you when I died? Oh, hence the terror. Then, Luke swallowed. What makes you think you died when I was young? Abruptly Anakin's tone was less gentle. Because you would have been raised on Tatooine over my dead body. That was news. Luke wanted children someday. He and Mara had begun prodding around the edges of the idea. And still at that early stage, even the thought of dying so young, of being unable to be there for his children, to see them grow. I'm sorry, Father, but I'm not sure I should tell you that. Because after all, he hadn't been raised on Tatooine over his father's dead body just in his father's ignorance, and he didn't want to have to lie about that, too. Please, Luke, his father said, imploring but once again shockingly gentle from the man who had once become Darth Vader. I know it happened in your past, but now you have the chance to change the past. You can change all of it. Anakin's face fought a brief battle with itself, then he continued. Whatever war and atrocities you've seen, whatever you've suffered, they don't have to happen. You can grow up with me and your mother. You can make the galaxy a less painful place. It was a long moment before Luke could say anything. He debated leaning into his cover, proclaiming something about how he was already working to do that by serving Mara, but he couldn't bear to. I'm sorry, Father, and he truly was. All things considered, Luke thought that he'd done an admirable job of not reacting when old Ben's Force ghost appeared in the hallway outside his cell, serene and blue-tinted as ever. The bounty hunter and the Inquisitor presumably couldn't see Ben, since they were continuing to sit there, bored as ever, the Inquisitor muttering threats under his breath, the bounty hunter lying back on the bench and staring up at the ceiling, legs kicking occasionally. The bounty hunter wouldn't be able to see Ben. And Luke kinda got the impression the Inquisitor wouldn't be disciplined enough to hide a reaction and that he definitely wouldn't bother even if he could. Mara, however, definitely knew. Luke could feel her attention sharpen when he reached for her mind, and after a moment she casually shifted her position so that she'd be able to look at Ben full on. Luke, conveniently, had already been sitting against the back wall of his cell and staring into the corridor. And since Ben had appeared right in front of him, he didn't have to fake shifting non-suspiciously after all. I'm sorry our communication must be so one-sided at the moment, Ben said, face fixed in a gentle smile. Nevertheless, it's very good to see you, Luke. And Mara Jade, he said, turning to her, it's a pleasure to formally make your acquaintance. Mara inclined her head in acknowledgement, then rested it on her fist to cover the action. I know you're both in a predicament at the moment, Ben continued, and Luke had to keep himself from snorting. Yeah, predicament stuck in the past. No idea why, no idea how to get home, no idea if they could get home, no idea if they could change the past. And unable to try because they were locked up and stuck pretending to be Sith Lords. Yep, predicament was one way to put it. Maybe Ben could sense the general direction of his thoughts because the old Jedi smile deepened. I'm afraid I have no explanation to offer you. I'm as ignorant as to how I ended up here as you are. All I know is that the Sith Temple pulled everything standing in its entrance back through time, and, unbeknownst to you, that included me. However, while I may not have an explanation, I do have a plan, one that I think may help alleviate some of your difficulties. At that, Luke couldn't stop himself from smiling, just the slightest bit. He had missed old Ben, and for all he had only known the man for a few days in life, had seen him rarely in the afterlife. Having his first teacher back, having someone to look to, someone familiar with the time, was a welcome surprise. You're kidding, Luke projected at Ben, his jaw clenched tight in the effort to keep it from falling open. He trusted Ben, but no part of this sounded like a good idea. No, Luke, I'm not kidding, Ben said. I assure you, it will be perfectly safe. I'd hardly want to harm my younger self, now would I? You just told me to attack him at full strength. How is that not going to harm him? I know I just told you to attack him, but I promise you, he truly won't be harmed, Ben replied, the repetition for Mara's benefit. Given that the inhibitors prevented her from hearing Luke's projections, Luke's mouth tightened. He trusted Ben, he really did, but this was a lot to ask. Even assuming I can win a fight against you, which I am definitely unsure of. I am not sold on this idea. Mara? Ben asked. Luke doubts he can win the fight, to which I would point out that he doesn't have to. He just has to hang on long enough. But he's still not sold on the plan. What are your thoughts? Mara might not be able to hear Luke's projections, but both Luke and Ben could pick up her surface thoughts through the Force. And when she wanted to, she could easily discipline her mind to constrain her surface thoughts to her responses alone. I think it's risky, she said, and significantly more ruthless than I expected of you. Oh? Ben asked, expression neutral. I'm sure you know enough of my history to know why I have a problem with this plan. But unfortunately, you're correct, we don't have a lot of options. We can't escape until we find the locations of the children the Inquisitor kidnapped. But we also can't do anything to affect the past from in here. I'm not sold on the idea that we can change it, but it would be stupid not to try. And in the meantime, if the Jedi lose patience and decide to execute us, we don't have the resources for me to be confident in our ability to escape. Ben frowned. You're right, I do understand why you'd object. But I also know what I would do to keep the future from happening, what my past self would allow to happen, if he knew. I notice you're not trying to convince me the vaunted and peaceful Old Jedi Order won't execute us. Mara thought a touch too loudly. Ben answered with a sigh. As much as I'd like to reassure you both that you're safe, the Order very much has a zero-tolerance policy for those who have fallen, much less Sith. And they do not believe that a return to the light is possible. Luke snorted faintly. Between Ben and Yoda's comments during his training, he'd very much noticed. Convenient that enabling you to achieve this plan is the only way to keep ourselves alive. Mara's mental voice was tight, but then, it had been tight for weeks, since they had first decided that the only way to save 36 kidnapped, Force-sensitive children was to have her pretend she still maintained her loyalty to the Empire. To have her pretend to torture him almost non-stop for 10 days, until he had supposedly broken and turned. Convenience wasn't my goal, Ben answered, eyebrow raised. Then he continued, much more gently, Mara, you were right to assume I would know why you dislike this plan. To tell you the truth, I'm not particularly fond of it myself. But I promise you I am not like Sidious. Mara's whole body tensed, even more so than Luke's did. Luke knew her well enough to suspect that it was in reaction to having her past vulnerabilities acknowledged. As for Luke himself, Mara should not have had to be told that. Should she? Ben had passed into the Force, or so Luke had thought, only a few days before Luke had met Mara, so they'd never talked before. But hadn't she believed his stories about old Ben? Hadn't she moved past the Imperial propaganda about the Jedi? Even if you thought you might be, you'd never admit it to us, Mara retorted, her eyes burning, her body ready to snap up at a moment's notice. She looked like she was about to pick a fight. Luke closed his eyes, just for a moment. Of course she did. That was how she reacted when she felt threatened, especially when those threats were emotional. Mara didn't think Ben was like Sidious. Not really. That wasn't what this was about. And after everything, he couldn't even comfort her. He sighed. Having to do this through Ben might not help. But, Ben, please tell her I said I know. She's not anything like Sidious either. Ben blinked. So maybe he hadn't read her quite that well. But then, from what he'd said, he'd only checked in on Luke very sporadically, and he and Mara had never spoken. Forgive me, Mara, but Luke requests that I tell you that he knows you're not anything like Sidious either. Mara's gaze whipped around to Luke, subtlety forgotten in her shock and anger. Mara had never reacted well to having her insecurities made public, but after what felt like years of staring at his face, Mara's expression softened. Thanks, farm boy. With a long, deep breath, Mara centered herself, and when her exhale finished, she thought, I'm sorry, Ben, that had very little to do with you. Another breath. I'm still not fond of the plan, but I can be pragmatic, and besides, it's not my help you need. Luke grimaced, and that brought them back to his problems with the plan. I get why you suggested this, Ben, but you still need to convince me, and you had better explain every single detail of how this would work. The day after Ben's proposal, Mara was taken for interrogation first. Her interrogator looked like he'd swallowed a large and foul-tasting insect, one that kept squirming in his mouth. It seems I owe you a thank you, Anakin Skywalker said. Darth Vader was thanking her. Maybe they really were in an alternate universe. Maybe a giant rainforest was about to spring up on Coruscant. Mara, heroically in her opinion, resisted the urge to needle him. Oh? For what? Mostly resisted the urge to needle him. Skywalker's face contorted again before he sighed. For the advice about my son, which you knew. So what? It worked? She asked, intonation as if she didn't already know and was ever so slightly bored at the thought of learning. Somewhat. I guess he responds really well to someone not yelling at him and torturing him. After all this time. Yes, he would, even if it wasn't his father. Luke had regularly informed her that he didn't resent her for the charade, back when she'd actually been pretending to torture him. But while he could still hear her thoughts, with the cuffs on, she couldn't do the same. Luke had to have noticed her discomfort, but thankfully he didn't seem to regard old Ben as an appropriate mediator for all conversations about her insecurities. The fact that Luke didn't hold it against her was, in fact, a Force-given miracle, but she certainly couldn't let any of that onto Anakin Skywalker. I told you he would, so, I get a stay of execution. Skywalker's expression of disgust returned in full force. Here I am trying to be a decent human being, he complained. Thank the Sith Lord. Just a little bit. And what do I get? Full stop. Skywalker clearly didn't expect a response. Mara gave him one anyway. You get me not taking immediate and aggressive measures to solidify the loyalty of my apprentice. You're in a cell. You can't hurt him anymore. I hope you're not so naive as to believe that I need a weapon or the Force to hurt him. Mara donned her most chilling smirk. After all, it wouldn't do to let Skywalker get overconfident, and she had a cover to maintain. Luke braced himself as he was pulled out of his cell for interrogation. The interrogations were a daily occurrence, still, and not a particularly pleasant one. However, while they were all still interrogated daily, 4 days without success had led the Jedi Council to hand the case off to a few primary investigators, while the rest went back to the business of war. Both conveniently and very uncomfortably, they'd been left to the same Jedi that had spent the most time in their company, and thus presumably had the most experience with them, Anakin and Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan was interrogating him alone that day, with the exception of one temple guard in the room, and whichever council member Luke suspected was hiding behind the one-way mirror. It presumably wasn't Anakin, since he'd hauled Mara off to her own interrogation, but even while tamping down his presence in the Force, Luke could feel that someone was there. Now, Obi-Wan began, how about today we talk some more about this supposed future of yours? Well, Luke smirked. You can ask. It was frustrating, really. For days he'd been debating the pros and cons of telling the Jedi, or at least telling Obi-Wan the truth about the fact that he wasn't super brainwashed and evil. And just as he had finally been working up to the decision that it was worth the risk, he couldn't, not without interfering with Ben's plan. Ben's plan could well preclude any attempts to make nice with the Jedi Council later on, but it was also a much surer bet than convincing them. For all Luke still kind of thought it was a terrible fucking idea. Very well, Obi-Wan said. Expression frozen neutrality. What led to the decline of the Jedi Order? Don't know much about that. It wasn't even a lie. The records from that era had all been erased, suppressed, or destroyed. Obi-Wan wasn't impressed. Then what you do know? Well, maybe Luke could give his first teacher something of a warning. Maybe it would do some good. The Sith. Obi-Wan's mouth tightened just the slightest bit. And how, exactly, did the Sith bring about the downfall of the Jedi? Luke forced his demeanor to stay nonchalant. There was killing involved. When did the downfall of the Jedi Order occur? Luke let himself sigh out loud. It was plausibly in character for him at the moment, and this would be a very long interrogation. It would behoove him, after all, to wait to make his move, and if he was very, very lucky, waiting would bring him a moment in which Obi-Wan was the slightest bit frustrated, the slightest bit less on guard. What do you know about the end of the Clone Wars? Luke shrugged. Obi-Wan hadn't taken an inch of focus off of Luke the entire time. Too busy reading Luke's body language, looking for the slightest hint of the future, the slightest indication of a lie. After all, the binders were supposed to hide his presence in the Force in a way that Luke had spent the past 2.5 weeks imitating. Obi-Wan would discern nothing that way. And the fact that Obi-Wan thought the inhibitor cuffs were working was Luke's only chance. When did the Clone Wars end? 19 BBY. Obi-Wan raised an eloquent eyebrow. 19 BBY. Before Battle of Yavin. Luke smiled, the memory of that day lending it the cold he currently needed. We got a new calendar system, and I don't suppose you know the date in Republic years. Well, Luke started, then he lunged. Obi-Wan jerked back, but not enough. He hadn't realized Luke had broken the cuffs binding his legs to the chair, or the chain linking the binders on his wrists. Luke grabbed Obi-Wan's arms, slammed into his chest, and shoved forward, tackling him across the table. Obi-Wan was trying to shove back with his arms, with the Force. But Luke had him by the forearms, giving him the superior leverage. And in the Force, well, the fact that his raw strength was greater than Obi-Wan's was the entire point of this. The temple guard grabbed at Luke's shoulder, presumably ready to pull him away from Obi-Wan so he could safely be stabbed. But the second he made contact, Luke lashed out with the Force, slammed the guard against the wall, and kept them pinned. He could hear frantic motion, slamming, from behind the glass, but all he could think about was his own fight. Obi-Wan tried to twist his arms out of Luke's grasp, succeeded in getting one knee under Luke's stomach, then the other, started to shove him off. That was when Luke grabbed every shred of the Force he could muster and shoved it into Obi-Wan's mind. Obi-Wan froze. Then his limbs seized, contorting wildly against Luke's pressure, then in the direction Luke had been trying to wrestle him, then out again, then sideways. Obi-Wan's mind contorted in the same rhythm, his shields distending, trying to shove off Luke's presence, to fold in on themselves and keep him from breaking through. Breaking down the shields of another Force-sensitive without shattering their mind was a complicated and subtle task. It was also something Luke didn't know how to do. Luckily, he didn't have to. The door burst open, Master Shaak Ti slamming a wave of the Force into Luke's side, one he only barely kept from dislodging him. There was a flash of blue in the corner of his eye. Luke couldn't look up from Obi-Wan's body, not while keeping up the massive influx of the Force and stopping the man's limbs from thrashing free. But he could see the wrinkled hand of Old Ben, invisible to all but Luke, smooth out Obi-Wan's forehead before the Force ghost placed one hand on each of Obi-Wan's temples. Obi-Wan jerked harder at the new Force presence, arms and torso and legs pushing up with all his strength. Shaak Ti's pressure in the Force hadn't ceased, coming up against his side, maybe hoping to outlast him. Then a tendril of the Force shot up under his chest without any warning. Luke slammed back first into the ceiling, but it didn't matter. The last of the blue glow next to Obi-Wan's head trailed away, and Old Ben was gone. Obi-Wan's limbs seized again, then dropped, and he fell into unconsciousness. 3 more temple guards rushed into the room, lightsaber pikes ignited. "I surrender," Luke forced out, finally having gotten his wind back after the impact. He spread his hands flat and open against the ceiling in a show of peace. Shaak Ti's gaze was as predatory as a Jedi Master's was probably allowed to get. "Yes," she stated, "I think you do." Luke groaned in pain as he collapsed onto the bench at the back of his cell. The fight with Obi-Wan had left him almost as bruised as the impact with the ceiling, and the unceremonious shove the temple guard had just used to push him into the cell hadn't helped. And that wasn't even starting on the intense, violent discomfort of being imprisoned in working Force binders. He'd lost access to the Force before. Shortly after meeting Mara, he'd had to learn to live without it more long-term, and managed to survive a week-long trek through a hostile forest. He could function without the Force well enough. But it would never, ever stop being unnerving. At no other time did Luke feel so limited, so cut off, so unable to perceive. Even before he had learned to use the Force, he had drawn on it unconsciously, used it to interpret the world around him. Mara had been dealing with this for 4 days already. With both of them in Force binders, he and Mara were cut off from private communication completely. Mara wasn't back yet, presumably still in her interrogation, and hopefully not worse off for what Luke had done. She had agreed to the plan, same as he had, but the plan had already caused enough pain, especially to people he cared about. And it would be naive to assume it wouldn't cause more, that Mara wouldn't be questioned more harshly, that Valen and the Inquisitor wouldn't demand to know what he was planning. That Ben wasn't at risk of being found out, that Ben's younger self wasn't in pain from the attack, and wouldn't suffer the consequences of what they'd done.